Your granddaughter shouldn't brag about you, her teacher said, his voice low enough that he probably thought it was private, but I was standing just behind him. You're just a welder. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't shout, but still hits like a hammer. The kind you feel in your chest before your mind even catches up. In that moment, the hallway felt smaller, the air heavier, and all I could think about was how those words, just a welder, would sound in my granddaughter's ears. She adored me. To her, I was the man who could make sparks fly in the dark, who could turn rough, cold steel into something strong and lasting. She'd never once seen my hands as dirty. She'd seen them as the hands that built things, and now someone was telling her that those hands, that work, didn't count for much. I didn't say anything. I didn't clear my throat to make him realize I'd heard. I didn't launch into a defense about how my welds held up the main suspension bridge that connected half the city, or how I'd been called in on jobs so dangerous that men with college degrees refused to touch them. I didn't list the factories, the water towers, the stadium beams I'd put together piece by piece until they could stand against storms. Words in that moment felt like trying to patch a crack with paper. They wouldn't hold. Instead, I kept walking, past the rows of bright lockers and student projects taped to the walls. I could hear children laughing somewhere down the hallway, the easy sound of voices that hadn't yet learned the language of status and titles. But I also heard my granddaughter's voice from the night before, telling me she had a surprise to show me at school, that she wanted me to meet her teacher because he likes smart people. I wondered if she'd already heard what he thought about me. Here's the thing about working with steel. You learn to respect its memory. Bend it, heat it, stretch it. It remembers. And people aren't much different. You can say something thoughtless, something careless, and long after you've forgotten it, the person you said it to will still feel it pressing against them. That's what I carried home that day. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of weight I couldn't put down. Still, I knew something else. I knew that steel, when handled right, could be made stronger at the very points where it had been under the most stress. That teacher thought he was making a crack in me, in the way my granddaughter saw me. But I had been repairing cracks all my life. Sooner or later I'd make sure he saw exactly what just a welder was capable of, and that when he did, he'd wish he'd chosen his words more carefully. Friends, let me take a short pause. Would you mind letting me know in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your life? When someone judged you too quickly or didn't see your worth? If this story speaks to you, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. That's how you help us grow and keep telling these stories that matter. And now we continue. She came home that evening quieter than usual. No bouncing up the steps, no stories spilling out before the front door had even closed. Just silence. The kind that carries weight. Her backpack slid off her shoulders and hit the floor with a soft thud. But she didn't look at me. She didn't rush to the garage to see what I was building. She just walked past me, eyes low, and sat at the kitchen table like something inside her had folded in on itself. I stood still for a moment, unsure whether to follow or give her space. But when your granddaughter starts acting like a stranger in her own home, your heart doesn't let you wait long. I sat across from her. She had her fingers pressed together, thumbs twitching, as if she was trying to hold something back. She didn't look up when she said it. Her voice barely reached above the hum of the refrigerator. He said you're just a welder. No name, no context, just he, but I knew, of course I knew. The words didn't come out angry. They came out like a confession, like she was ashamed to even repeat them. And that's what hurt more than anything. Not that he'd said it, but that some part of her had let those words sink in. Some part of her had taken them seriously. It was the first time I saw hesitation in her. Not the kind of teenage rebellion where they roll their eyes and think they know better. No, this was different. This was uncertainty. This was a girl who had always looked at me with admiration, now questioning whether she was allowed to. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I felt something close inside my chest. A quiet ache, not from pride, but from fear. Fear that the world had gotten to her before I could teach her what actually mattered. That some man in a collared shirt, with a degree on the wall and dustless hands, had convinced her that work was only worthy if it looked clean. She picked at the edge of the table, the way she used to do when she was nervous before a school test. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about me. This was about her. About the fact that the pride I had passed down to her, the sense of worth built on grit and craft, had been rattled. And I hated that. I hated that someone who barely knew me could reach through her with a single sentence and steal something that had taken years to build. I wanted to tell her so many things, about the structures I'd welded together in freezing wind, about the nights I came home with burns on my arms and stories in my bones, about the weight of responsibility I'd carried every time a team of men walked across a platform I had built, about the time an engineer called me in to redo someone else's failed work, and I didn't rub it in, I just made it right. But I didn't say any of that, because what she needed in that moment wasn't a defense. It was certainty. She needed to feel it, not hear it, that who I was hadn't changed just because someone else didn't understand it. So I stood, walked over to the workbench by the window, and quietly placed in front of her the little iron flower I had welded the day before. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, eyes softening just a little. I saw the weight start to lift, barely, like the first bit of sun after a long clouded morning. Still, I knew the damage had been done. And damage, as any welder knows, is easiest to hide when it's inside the seams. But that's also where the strongest welds begin. It's strange how a few careless words, said in passing, not meant to wound deeply, can still find their way beneath the skin, settle into the bone, and begin to change something in the silence that follows. Her teacher probably didn't think twice after he said it. Maybe he didn't even remember by the time he reached the next conversation, the next student. But for us, it stayed. Not like a storm. Not loud, not even sharp. More like rust. Slow, quiet, and persistent. The days after that felt different. She still came over after school. Still hugged me when she walked in. Still asked what was for dinner. But there was a new quiet between us. The kind that doesn't come from distance, but from doubt. I'd ask how her classes were going, and she'd smile, but her eyes moved too quickly past mine. I'd show her a piece I was working on in the garage, a curved stair rail I was shaping for a family who had finally saved enough to renovate their old farmhouse, and she'd nod and say it looked nice, but the spark in her voice was gone. She still looked, but she wasn't seeing, and I could feel it. Not all at once, but in small, steady ways. Like the way she no longer pointed out my welding mask to her friends when they came by. The way she didn't ask to help polish a finished piece anymore, or request a new sculpture for her shelf. She hadn't turned against me. No, it was worse than that. She was slowly letting the world's opinion reshape her understanding of me. And isn't that what betrayal really is sometimes? Not rejection, but quiet erosion. The world had drawn a neat little box around what success looked like, what intelligence meant, what kind of people were allowed to be admired. And even though she'd grown up hearing my stories, even though she'd touched the hot metal and watched it bend under fire, even though she'd once told me I was like a magician, but real, even then, the box still closed around her. Not because she believed it completely, but because she didn't know how to fight it. And maybe I hadn't taught her how. That thought stung more than anything her teacher had said. I'd spent years building with my hands, but had I spent enough time building in her a defense against this kind of quiet judgment? Did I ever sit her down and say, "This world will try to measure you by things that shine, but the things that hold it together are often buried, heavy, and unsung"? Or had I assumed that love and presence were enough, that the truth would speak for itself? I started replaying things in my head. Times when I should have explained more. Times when I let other people call me just good with tools and didn't bother correcting them. Moments when I laughed off being underestimated because I was used to it, not realizing she was watching, absorbing, and learning from my silence. She was learning that even someone strong could be quietly dismissed. That skill without a title was something to apologize for. That loving someone who wasn't seen as important might cost you approval in the places you wanted to belong. And that realization, that my silence might have helped carve the very path to this moment, was a deeper cut than any insult. I kept welding that week, kept building the stair rail piece by piece. My hands moved the same way they always did, steady and certain, but my heart was heavier. Because now, every time the sparks flew, I wasn't just thinking about steel, I was thinking about her. And I was thinking about the quiet damage done when a child hears, for the first time, that the person they admire isn't worth admiring. No one saw me that week, not really. Just a man in a garage shaping metal. But inside, I was trying to weld something else entirely, trying to hold together the invisible threads between who I was and how she saw me, trying to protect the story of myself that lived inside her before someone else rewrote it. I could have said so much. I could have walked into that school the next day, stood in front of her teacher with my hands calloused and chin high, and told him the truth. Not the truth he thought he knew, about job titles and social worth, but the truth forged in sweat and silence, that some men leave legacies not in books or broadcasts, but in the way cities stand, and people walk across them without fear. I could have listed the names of the bridges I welded, the factories whose spines I helped shape, the storm-battered towers I reinforced after hurricanes when no one else would climb that high. I could have rolled out blueprints with initials scribbled in the corners, initials that matched mine, and said, "Look again." But I didn't, because something in me, something old and worn but still proud, refused to plead for value I knew I already had. I've spent my life working in heat so intense it bent steel. I've lifted beams heavier than most men's doubts. And yet, it still stings, doesn't it? When someone looks at all of that and sees only the soot, not the strength. That week I said nothing. Not to the teacher, not even to my granddaughter. I cooked her favorite meal. I listened when she talked about her classes. I nodded when she said they'd started a new unit in science, ironically about structures and materials. She didn't mention the teacher again. She didn't bring up what he'd said, but his words sat between us like a shadow neither of us wanted to name. And maybe silence is what I chose. But inside, something shifted. Not anger. No, I've seen too much to waste time on that. What I felt was deeper, quieter. The kind of hurt that doesn't scream, but settles in your chest and sits there like weight you've carried for years but only now noticed. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated me. I remember once, decades ago, being called in to finish a job where the architect's vision had exceeded the engineer's caution. The structure was elegant on paper, a curved walkway over a river with no easy supports. But in the real world, elegance needs more than ink. It needs balance, calculation, and the hands of someone who understands tension not just mathematically, but viscerally. They called me a day before the deadline. The welds weren't holding. The structure was flexing dangerously, and so I stood on scaffolding in the pouring rain, reworking every joint, reinforcing what had been rushed. No plaque bore my name when it opened. No camera panned to the man beneath the hard hat, but I didn't need it. I watched the first mother push a stroller across that bridge, and I knew I had built something real. Still, I think part of me had always hoped that one day someone would see it. Not for praise, not for status, just to be understood. To have someone look at what I've done and say, "You mattered." And maybe that's what shook me now. Not that her teacher hadn't seen it, but that she, my granddaughter, might start to unsee it too. I've always believed that the strongest things are built without applause, that the things which last are forged in silence. But silence is also where doubt can grow. And I realized painfully that the silence I had worn like armor all my life might have become a veil for her. She couldn't see the legacy through it. And maybe that was my fault. So I didn't explain myself, didn't pull out old photos or worn newspaper clippings. I let her sit in the quiet with me, hoping that love alone would speak loud enough, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. She needed to see something more, not words, not stories. Proof. And whether I wanted it or not, the moment was coming when she and he would see it. Not because I forced it, but because the truth, like molten steel, eventually surfaces. and when it does, it holds. The invitation came folded in her backpack, a simple flyer printed in bright ink, asking parents and grandparents to speak at the upcoming Career Discovery Day. She left it on the kitchen counter without a word, like she wasn't sure whether I'd want to go, or whether I should go. I stood there for a long time staring at it. There was no mention of what had been said that week before. No awkward apologies, no soft explanations. But I saw something in her eyes when I picked it up. Something careful. Like she was handing me a match near dry leaves, unsure if I'd strike it or walk away. I told her I'd come, just that. No grand speech, no forced cheer. And in truth, I wasn't going for the school. I wasn't going for the other kids. I was going for her, because she needed to see me not through the teacher's lens, but through my own. And I needed that too, more than I wanted to admit. I didn't dress up, didn't iron a dress shirt or borrow a tie. I wore what I always wore when I wanted to feel grounded, the faded canvas jacket with scorch marks on the cuffs, the heavy boots that had stood on rebar and scaffolding, on gravel and factory floor. My hands were clean, but the traces of a life in labor never fully leave you. The grooves in your palms, the tightness in the knuckles, the way you carry weight, even when there's nothing in your hands. The school smelled like fresh paint and pencil shavings. The walls were lined with colorful art and polite posters about kindness and future goals. Other adults stood in the hallway with glossy brochures, crisp shirts, and practiced smiles. One man rolled in a display monitor and clicked through slides about mergers and venture capital. A woman beside him unboxed tiny giveaways. Branded pens, stickers, lanyards. Their tables gleamed, their titles glimmered. I had brought a small piece I welded the week before. Not a flashy project, just a section of spiral piping shaped like a wave, curving clean and smooth. I set it down on my table and stepped back. No business cards, no banner, just the metal. At first, no one stopped. A few kids passed by, eyes flicking past me to the shinier booths. Some pointed, some whispered, but mostly they moved on. Even the teacher, him, walked past with a polite nod, the same kind you give to someone bagging your groceries. I nodded back. I didn't need his approval, I just needed time. He did. And then she came. My granddaughter stood across from me, unsure, not embarrassed, not proud, just watching, measuring. I didn't reach for her. I didn't say anything. I let her look. Let her take in the way the welds curved in quiet rhythm. Let her see the gloves in my back pocket, the steady stillness of someone who had nothing to sell and everything to show. One boy stopped, then another. A few girls stepped closer, their curious fingers hovering above the curve of steel. One asked how it was made, and I began to speak, slowly, plainly, the way you do when you want someone to feel a thing, not just understand it. I told them about heat, tension, pressure, about how metal remembers the force you put into it, about the way you learn to listen to vibration, to smell when a weld's gone wrong, to see weakness before it fractures. More students came. The questions became real. One girl asked if it was dangerous. I said yes, and that's why it mattered. And then, something I didn't expect. The teacher walked over. I didn't look at him, just kept talking. But I could feel his presence shift, from passing curiosity to reluctant attention. The bell rang to signal the end of the round. Kids scattered, but my granddaughter stayed. She ran her fingers over the piping, then looked up, and the doubt I had seen before, it wasn't there anymore. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Because sometimes the loudest redemption doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from standing in your truth, unmoved, from showing up not to explain, but simply to be fully, quietly, unmistakably yourself. And I had done that. Not with speeches, not with resumes, with metal, with presence, with the dignity of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to remind. I arrived early that morning not because I wanted extra time to prepare, but because years of labor had wired me to show up before the whistle, to stand in the space before things begin, to measure a room in silence before filling it with presence. I didn't expect much. I didn't need handshakes or banners or someone to walk me in with applause. But I did expect basic human regard. The front office buzzed with soft, polite chaos. Teachers checking schedules, parents straightening papers, volunteers offering donuts in paper napkins. I was told to wait briefly in the staff lounge, and I did, stepping into a room filled with the smell of weak coffee and dry erase markers, a few chairs, a bulletin board, the worn hum of fluorescent lights overhead. And then he walked in. Her teacher, the one who said it, the one who let the words, "just a welder," slide off his tongue with all the weight of a sigh, as if he'd been talking about someone barely worth noticing. He saw me. Our eyes met for a flicker, and then he turned his head, walked past me like I was part of the furniture, not with anger, not even discomfort, but with something colder, indifference. That quiet dismissal, that silent acknowledgement of nothing, cuts deeper than open insult. An insult at least admits you exist. But this was erasure. Like I hadn't stood in his classroom and watched my granddaughter wilt under the shadow of his words. Like I hadn't lived an entire life behind the welds he probably passed on the highway without ever thinking of the hands that made them. Like I was just background. He glanced at my jacket, the same one I wore to job sites in winter, the one with the burn marks near the wrists and the frayed collar where leather had softened with time. His eyes lingered there a second too long, and then moved on. Not to my face, not to my hands, to the coffee machine, to a conversation with someone else, to anything but me. And I stood there still, not embarrassed, not shaken, just reminded. Reminded that for some people, value is measured in polish, in degrees framed on the wall, in clean cuffs and quiet rooms where nothing ever smells like sweat or flame. Reminded that the deeper the roots of your work go, the more invisible you become to those who only notice surface. But I also remembered something else. I remembered the men I'd worked beside in the cold, trading stories over sparks and breathing in air thick with steel dust. I remembered the foreman who told me I had the steadiest hands he'd seen in 30 years. I remembered the time I rebuilt a beam overnight after the original one cracked, and the crew refused to clock out until they shook my hand. That man in the staff lounge didn't see any of that. He didn't want to. To him, I was a silent frame in the corner of his day. But I had lived a life full of noise, full of heat, full of meaning, and the coldness of his reception didn't cool any of that. It only made the fire in me burn steadier. The quiet resolve that I didn't need his gaze to make my work real. My story was already written in welds and weight, in arcs and angles, in places his kind rarely looked. And if he couldn't see it, then that blindness was his burden to carry, not mine. The classroom was warm and full of motion, the way rooms always are when anticipation mixes with curiosity. Children sat at their desks, eyes bouncing between the door and the teacher, waiting for the next speaker to arrive. I paused for a moment before entering, hearing their laughter, their rustling papers, the innocent buzz of minds not yet hardened by judgment, and then I stepped inside. I didn't expect applause, and I didn't get it. I didn't expect silence either, and thankfully that didn't come. Instead, what I walked into was a wave of voices, excited chatter, eager hands shooting up with questions before I'd even opened my mouth. Not about welding, not yet, just about me. Are you the welder? Did you really build a bridge? Is it true you work with fire? The questions tumbled over one another like sparks, spilling from a cut, chaotic, bright, alive. And for a moment I forgot the stiffness in my spine, the memory of the teacher's cold glance, the heaviness of what had led us here. I just smiled, not because I had anything to prove, but because these children didn't yet see the world in layers of status. To them, I wasn't just anything. I was someone new, someone different, someone who might bring stories that smelled like smoke and sounded like adventure. But then my eyes shifted to the back of the room, and there he was. The teacher, her teacher, leaning against the edge of his desk, arms folded, expression unreadable. He didn't move when I entered, didn't offer a welcome or a nod or even a glance of interest. He simply watched, like he was waiting for me to slip, like he was expecting something crude and simple, something he could quietly roll his eyes at later and use as proof that the world should stay divided between thinkers and doers, between professionals and the rest of us. There was no hostility in his stare, and somehow that made it worse. There was only anticipation, awaiting for me to confirm his version of reality. And I could feel it, that tight little pull in my chest again, the pressure to speak carefully, to show them something worthwhile, to prove myself not just to the children, but to the man who had already dismissed me long before I walked through the door. But I didn't perform. I didn't bring a presentation or a slideshow or a speech. I brought metal. I reached into the canvas bag I'd carried and pulled out 2 pieces. One was a small section of raw steel pipe, jagged and unfinished, cold to the touch. The other was a carefully shaped and polished weld, seamless and curved, something I had built by hand over the course of 2 evenings, knowing I would be here. I didn't speak like a lecturer. I spoke like I do on a job site, plain, deliberate, steady. I told them about pressure, about heat, about the way metal bends when you push it too hard and breaks if you push it the wrong way. I told them about the quiet math of it, the art hidden in precision, the difference between a weld that holds and one that cracks when lives depend on it. And as I spoke, I saw something beautiful happen. Their faces changed, not with awe, but with realization. They began to understand that the work I did wasn't chaos and fire, but control and understanding. That every spark they imagined came from knowledge, from training, from years of listening to the language of metal the way others listen to poetry. The teacher still hadn't moved, but his eyes had narrowed. He wasn't watching to judge anymore. He was watching to understand, and that surprised him, because people like him rarely expect understanding to come from hands like mine. But I didn't look at him again. My eyes stayed on the children, on their curiosity, their questions, their amazement, when I passed the pieces around and let them feel the difference between raw and refined. And behind all of that, my granddaughter sat at her desk, eyes wide, posture tall, the corners of her mouth just beginning to curve upward. Not in pride, not yet, but in something softer, the return of belief, the return of something she didn't have a name for, but that I recognized the moment I saw it. It was trust. Trust finding its way back into the shape of her smile. And no matter what that teacher thought, no matter how tightly he kept his arms folded, that was all I needed. When the bell rang and the children reluctantly gathered their things, a soft current of excitement still lingered in the room. Some of them clutched the small pieces of metal I'd let them pass around, still warm from the stories behind them. I stood off to the side now, watching them scatter in groups, their voices drifting like wind through high beams. I wasn't looking for anything, just soaking in the moment, letting it settle in the way heat lingers long after the flame has gone out. That's when I saw it. Lying casually on the teacher's desk, half covered by a folder and a ballpoint pen, was a thick engineering textbook, the kind used in high school programs or introductory college classes. Its corners were dog-eared, its pages stuffed with sticky notes, and the glossy cover bore the marks of regular use. But what caught me, what stopped me, was the image on the front. A bridge, long, lean, and elegant, stretching across a river under a cloudless sky. I knew that bridge the way a man knows the lines of his own hand, because I had welded it, not supervised it, not drawn it on paper. I had been there, every day before the sun came up, every night, when others had gone home, in rain, in wind, through equipment failures and deadline pressures and budget cuts. I had stood on the beams and held steel in place when the welds had to be perfect, because perfection was the only thing that stood between people and collapse. They had chosen that bridge for the cover, and there it was, under his pen, under his hand. I walked over slowly, not to say anything, just to look, just to let my eyes rest on the quiet irony of it all. He had no idea. The man who told my granddaughter I was just a welder was teaching out of a book that featured my work, a structure I had helped birth from blueprints and bureaucracy into weight and wind and steel. It wasn't my name on the cover. That's not how these things work. The credit usually goes to the architect or the firm. But inside, buried in the acknowledgments, was a list of contributors, subcontractors, consulting specialists. My name wasn't bold. It wasn't centered. It was there like I've always been, tucked in, silent, steady, but there. I didn't reach for the book, didn't flip it open. I didn't need to. I knew that structure inside and out. I knew every weld line, every tension joint, every challenge that blueprint didn't account for. And standing there, I realized something strange. I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. I didn't feel like I had won some secret war against judgment or ignorance. What I felt was a kind of quiet sorrow. Because he could have known. He could have taken the time to look at the people behind the pages he taught from, could have seen that the theories he recited had hands behind them, not just ideas, but labor, sweat, precision that left burn marks and fingerprints on real structures in real cities. He taught about strength, load-bearing, stress distribution, but he didn't know what it meant to carry that weight, to feel it in your back, your lungs, your bones. And it wasn't his fault entirely. That's the world we live in. A world where the builder is forgotten and the signature matters more than the steel. A world where the photo on the cover is admired, but the man behind the mask, the one standing on the scaffold with the torch, is invisible. Still, it was poetic, wasn't it? That he stood inches from something he respected, never knowing he had once dismissed the hands that built it. My granddaughter noticed me looking. She wandered over, curious, following my gaze. "Do you know that bridge?" she asked, and I simply nodded. I didn't tell her, not yet, because some truths don't need to be said out loud. They just need to be seen. And one day, when she was ready to ask the deeper question, I'd hand her the documents, the photos, the welding logbook I kept all those nights, notes scrawled in the margins when my fingers were too tired to hold the pen steady. She'd know. But not for pride, not for revenge, for legacy. Because sometimes it's not the loudest stories that last. It's the ones written in the weight of what still stands. I hadn't planned to touch the book. Honestly, I had no intention of proving anything to anyone. But as the students filtered out of the classroom and the room began to quiet, something in me shifted. Not out of pride. No, I'd lived too long and worked too hard for shallow vindication. It was something deeper. A quiet certainty rising to the surface, like a weld cooling into final form. I walked to his desk. He was still gathering his things, papers rustling, his gaze avoiding mine with polite efficiency, as if he could feel the tension but was trying to move past it before it required acknowledgement. The textbook lay exactly where it had been, slightly askew, the image of my bridge still watching the room like a silent witness. I reached for it, slow, calm, not for effect, for reverence, because I knew what this book represented. Not fame, not glory, but documentation. Evidence. The kind of quiet record that most people never read cover to cover, but that holds names like mine between its lines, tucked beside formulas and sketches, between case studies and citations. I opened it with the care of someone returning to an old place, familiar but sacred. The spine cracked faintly as I turned the pages, through materials, measurements, tolerances, fatigue curves, and then I reached the section I knew by heart. Structural welding and steel integration in suspended bridge design. There, spanning 2 pages, was the technical case study of the very bridge from the cover. Tables of data, thermal distortion analysis, cross-sectional heat profiles. It was clinical, the kind of language that masks effort with numbers, but I could see past all of it. I could see the days I stood in winter wind welding horizontal joints on that river span. I could feel the torch again in my hands, hear the static in my radio earpiece as we double-checked the line elevation. I could smell the mix of ozone and scorched steel. And then I turned to the final paragraph of the section, to a page no student would probably ever stop at. Acknowledgements. The authors would like to recognize the field contributions and on-site consultation of... There it was. My name. Not in bold, not underlined, just printed in the same type as everyone else's, a name among names, but mine. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I simply laid the book gently open on the desk, turned it so he could see, and tapped once on the margin of the page, a gesture without force, without spite. He looked down. At first, there was nothing in his face, just routine curiosity. And then, his expression changed, not drastically, just enough. His eyes stilled, his mouth opened slightly, then closed again. It was the kind of reaction a man has when something cracks quietly inside, when the shape of the world as he's known it shifts by a fraction, and he realizes he's been looking at it backward. He looked at me then, for the first time, really looked. And there was something in that glance that wasn't pity or apology or even regret. It was recognition, the kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness but admits it was blind. I held his gaze for a breath, not to win, not to shame him, but to show him I was never invisible. You just never knew where to look. Then I closed the book. And in that soft click of pages meeting spine, something ended. Not the story, not the wound, but the silence. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. Not loudly, not like triumph, but like justice. The quiet kind. The kind that comes not with applause, but with the simple satisfaction of truth being seen. Finally. For what it always was. And in the back of the room, my granddaughter watched it all. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had seen me bend steel, hold fire, build with my hands. But this was the first time she saw my name in ink. And sometimes that's all it takes to rebuild what someone else tried to rust. The silence that followed was unlike any I had heard in a classroom before. Not the polite stillness that comes when a teacher raises their hand, not the bored quiet of students waiting for a bell. This silence had weight. It sat in the room like dust settling after something large had shifted, something everyone had felt but no one fully understood yet. At first it was the students who whispered, not loud, not disruptive, but enough for the air to feel electric. Their eyes darted from the open textbook to me and then back again. Some looked to the teacher, their faces full of questions they didn't quite know how to ask. Is that really him? How? Why didn't we know? They had just listened to me talk about welds and weight, about heat and risk and the dignity of building things. But now they were realizing that I hadn't come with examples from someone else's work. I had brought my own. And not only that, I had been part of the very material they were studying. In a world full of presentations, slides, and stories designed to impress, there is something disarming and quietly humbling about a truth that reveals itself without force. No spotlight, no speech, just a man pointing to his name in a book and letting the weight of that reality speak in his place. The teacher was still. His arms had fallen from their folded posture, one hand resting limply on his desk, the other motionless on a stack of papers. His eyes were locked on the page, not scanning, not skimming, just seeing. Finally, seeing. And what he saw wasn't just my name. He saw the space between his assumptions and the truth. He saw the gap between title and contribution. He saw the man he had passed in the teacher's lounge without a nod, now connected to the very bridge that had likely been used as an example in dozens of his lessons. And the look in his eyes, it wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't defensiveness. It was something deeper. A quiet crumbling of certainty. The unsettling realization that he had taught about the strength of steel, while dismissing the very hands that had made it hold. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Because I knew that what was happening in that moment wasn't about victory. It was about realignment. His worldview. The neatly arranged hierarchy of professions, credentials, worth, was beginning to tilt. And when the foundation of something built on assumption begins to shift, it doesn't collapse immediately. It groans. It resists. It forces you to feel every inch of the change. That's what I saw on his face. The first tremors of a structure learning to bend instead of break. I stepped back from the desk, not to retreat, but to give the truth space to echo. I glanced at the students, some of whom were still watching me with wide eyes, some whispering to each other with a new tone, not of disbelief, but of awe, the kind that doesn't just come from recognition, but from recalibration. They were putting the pieces together, realizing that the man who'd walked in with burned cuffs and quiet hands had been part of something they'd only ever seen in photos and diagrams. In the back of the room, my granddaughter hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken since I opened that book, but her silence was louder than all the whispers. Her eyes were locked on me, and in them, I saw something stronger than pride. I saw restoration, not just of how she saw me, but how she saw herself in connection to me. Because when a child believes the world's version of success, they sometimes start to shrink the people they love to fit inside it. But when they see that world crack open, even just a little, they begin to reclaim what was always theirs to be proud of. I nodded to her gently, and in return she sat up straighter in her seat. The silence in the classroom remained a moment longer, sacred almost. And then, like a slow breath returning after a long pause, the room began to move again, quietly, cautiously, with the kind of new awareness that only comes after something unspoken has finally been seen. After the last rustle of pages and chairs settled, the teacher asked if I wanted to say a few closing words to the class. His voice was more careful now, not tentative, but changed, as if he'd begun to realize he wasn't just offering me a courtesy, but an overdue space to be heard. I stood in front of the room again, but this time the air felt different. The weight of what had just unfolded, the open textbook, the silent recognition, the thread of awe running through the room. All of it hung there, like metal cooling slowly in the stillness after the flame. I looked at those young faces, eyes open wide. Not a single phone out, not a glance toward the clock. They weren't waiting to be entertained. They were waiting to understand. So I spoke, not like a lecturer or a guest, but like a man who had waited years for someone to ask the question properly. What do you do and why does it matter? I didn't talk about careers or salaries or college tracks. I didn't explain what welding certification meant or how many hours I'd worked without complaint. I didn't even mention the bridge again. I told them what it meant to build something no one would ever know you built, and to do it well anyway. I told them about mornings before dawn, standing in snow, waiting for the crane to bring down the first beam so I could place the root weld that would hold up the rest. I told them about working in silence, with men who didn't speak much but would trust you with their life on the scaffold. I told them about mistakes, not mine but others, that I'd covered without blame, because when something had to be fixed, there wasn't time for ego. And then I told them the truth no one ever puts on posters, that sometimes the most important people in a room aren't in the room at all. They're the ones who came before it existed, the ones who built it. I could feel the words land, not because they were powerful, but because they were honest. There was no polish on them, no metaphor, just the plain weight of a life lived in labor. And they listened. Even the ones who looked restless earlier were still now. Not frozen, but softened. Like someone had told them something they'd always sensed was true, but had never heard said out loud. I looked down at my hands. I told them that sometimes these hands had come home trembling, burned, bruised, but they had never once dropped the work. Because the people who walk over your welds, on bridges, in factories, in hospitals, they trust what they can't see. And that trust, it's sacred. And then I paused, looked across the rows of desks, and said something I hadn't planned, something that rose in my throat without rehearsing. You'll be told that certain jobs matter more than others, that titles decide importance. But I promise you, sometimes the one they call just a welder is the only reason the roof stays standing, not just in buildings, but in families. For a moment I thought my voice might break, because what I really meant was her, my granddaughter, the child whose trust I had carried like a fragile beam across so many quiet years, the one I had tried to protect from this world's brutal habit of measuring worth with the wrong tools. I hadn't always known how to speak my value. Men like me were taught to show it, not say it. But in that moment I realized she needed it spoken. She needed to hear, in front of others, that the man who hugged her after school and cooked her pancakes on weekends had not just built things, he had held things together. And I saw it then, the moment her chin lifted, the way her shoulders squared, as if something that had been pulled out from under her had suddenly been put back, not with shouting, not with proof, but with truth. In that classroom, surrounded by equations and charts and posters about careers, I had not given them a lecture. I had given them a bridge between perception and reality, between silence and recognition, between a generation that builds quietly and one that is still learning where to look for strength. And I knew, as I stepped back and thanked them, that nothing in the room would be quite the same again. Not the teacher, not the students, and not my granddaughter. That moment, quiet, heavy, sacred, was the turning point. Not because I changed their minds, but because I helped her reclaim hers. The classroom slowly emptied, footsteps echoing softer with each passing second. Backpacks were slung over shoulders. Voices faded into the hallway, and the noise of shifting chairs gave way to a quiet that felt almost sacred. My granddaughter lingered near the door, speaking with a friend, stealing glances toward me. Not nervous now, but changed. Her eyes no longer held the question I had seen in them days ago. That question had been answered. I stood beside the desk where the book still lay open. I hadn't closed it. I didn't need to. It had done its work, not as a weapon but as a window, a quiet, undeniable reminder of what was real. And then slowly I heard his steps behind me. The teacher. He approached with none of the performative confidence he'd carried earlier in the day. No clipboard, no instruction in his posture, just the sound of shoes against tile and the weight of something unspoken drawing closer. I didn't turn immediately. I let him take his time. Some moments demand silence more than speech. When I finally looked at him, he stood still, maybe a foot away, arms no longer crossed, hands at his sides. Not defensive, not proud, just present. And that alone felt monumental. He opened his mouth once, closed it, looked down, looked at the book again, looked at me, and then didn't speak. And I understood. There are apologies that words cannot carry. Realizations that arrive not with a speech, but with surrender. He didn't need to say he was wrong. The silence between us already held that. He didn't need to explain what he thought before. Or why. His eyes carried the weight of it, and that was enough. He gave a small nod. Not a casual one, not a gesture meant to move past the discomfort. This one was deliberate, subtle, firm. The kind of nod that men give when they're learning to see for the first time and aren't sure what to do with the clarity. And in that second, I saw the difference. Before, I had been someone he couldn't categorize, a man in a worn jacket, too quiet to be a threat, too humble to be considered valuable. But now, I was undeniable, and not because of the bridge, not even because of the book, but because I had stood in front of his students and told them something truer than anything they'd find in diagrams and formulas. I had shown them that value doesn't live in titles or polish. It lives in what remains standing after others stop noticing. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask forgiveness. He didn't speak at all. But when he turned and walked away, slower this time, I didn't feel bitterness. I didn't need his words to justify the life I had built with my hands. What I needed was already behind me. A young girl watching her grandfather, not through the lens of shame, but with the full weight of returned pride. The door clicked closed after him. I stayed behind for a moment, alone in the room that now felt less like a classroom and more like a quiet reckoning. Some conversations are loud. They spill out in arguments, accusations, justifications. But some, the rarest ones, are made of silence so full it says everything. And when that man nodded, I knew the story had changed. Not just his version of me, but his version of worth. That change would echo forward, into how he taught, into how he spoke to the next child who came from working hands, into the way he looked at names in books and faces in hallways. And I didn't need applause. I had been building lives long before anyone bothered to ask who the welder was. We walked together down the hallway, the building now quiet, except for the low hum of overhead lights and the soft scuff of her shoes beside mine. The world outside the school was waiting, sun filtering through clouds, the scent of early spring in the air, but inside time felt slower, like the moment wasn't quite ready to let us go. She held the engineering textbook tight against her chest, her small arms wrapped around it the way a child might hold something fragile or sacred. The same book that had, until today, been just another part of her routine, now transformed. She walked a little closer to me than usual, her steps in quiet sync with mine, and though she didn't say much at first, the weight of everything that had passed between us filled the air like something too important for fast words. I glanced down at her, and she looked up at me. There was no hesitation in her eyes anymore, no embarrassment, no distance. What I saw instead was the quiet gleam of belief returned, not the naive, uncomplicated awe of childhood, but something deeper, something that had been tested, cracked, and reforged stronger. She smiled, that kind of smile that doesn't stretch wide but reaches all the way through the eyes, and I knew. She had seen everything she needed to see. When she finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper, but it reached straight through my ribs. I always knew you were special, Grandpa. Now they know too. I didn't answer right away. Her words didn't ask for a reply. They asked to be felt, and I did, with every part of me, not as triumph, not as vindication, but as restoration. The kind that happens when something precious you thought might be lost is returned to you intact, and even stronger than before. She held the book a little tighter. I remembered how small her hands were when I first taught her how to hold a piece of metal without flinching. I remembered her sitting on the workshop floor, legs crossed, watching me weld through the protective glass, her face glowing in the reflection of the sparks. I remembered how, back then, I wasn't just a welder. I was hers, the one who could make fire dance and steel submit, the one who came home smelling like heat and dust and something ancient. And then, just days ago, I'd felt that image slip. Not completely, but just enough to feel the loss. Just enough to wonder if the world had managed to wedge itself between us, prying open the space where pride once lived. But now? Now the bond had returned, not out of nostalgia, but out of something real, earned, seen, witnessed. She had watched me step into a place that didn't expect much from me and leave it marked, changed. She had seen the man behind the stories. Not the myth, not the fantasy, the truth. I didn't need her praise. But knowing she could carry my name again without shrinking beneath it, that mattered more than any recognition I could ever receive. We walked through the school doors together into the light. She didn't rush ahead like she sometimes did. She walked beside me, textbook still pressed close, like a secret finally understood. And though she didn't say anything more, her silence spoke volumes. It said, "You're not just my grandfather. You're someone the world should know." And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt known. Pride doesn't always return with a cheer. Sometimes it comes back the way a spark returns to cooling metal, faint at first, then slowly warming the surface until it shines again. That evening I sat alone in my garage, the hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead barely louder than the ticking of cooling steel on the workbench. My gloves were off, my hands resting quietly in my lap, still smelling faintly of wire and smoke. I wasn't building anything that night, not with tools, not with fire. I was simply sitting with the weight of the day, not to relive it, but to finally breathe through it. I had spoken my truth without demanding to be heard. I had shown them not my strength, but my steadiness. And somehow, that had been louder than anything I could have shouted. In my younger years, I used to think justice was a grand thing, a gavel, a confrontation, a correction shouted into a room. But time teaches you that some wrongs don't need noise to be made right. Some wrongs dissolve the moment truth is seen. And that's what had happened in that classroom. No debate, no defense, just truth, standing still in the middle of the room, too real to ignore. The teacher never said he was sorry, and strangely, I didn't need him to, because what I had watched happen in his eyes was bigger than an apology. I had watched a man realize that the world was wider than he'd allowed himself to see, that people he once overlooked were quietly carrying more than he could measure, that what he taught in theory had been standing in front of him in practice, alive, unassuming, and undeniable. And the students, they had seen it too. They had watched something bend in real time, a boundary, a hierarchy, an assumption. And when a child witnesses that, when they see grown-ups shift, it leaves a mark, a new awareness, a new humility. Maybe they wouldn't all remember my name, but they would remember what it felt like when the lines blurred between who's on the page and who built the page. And my granddaughter, she had carried that truth out with her, not like a lesson, like a torch. I looked across the garage at the shelf where I kept the small welded figurines I used to make for her when she was little. Dinosaurs, butterflies, a tiny horse that had taken me 3 evenings to shape. She hadn't asked for a new one in years, but tonight I found myself reaching for the scraps again. Not because she needed another toy, because I wanted her to hold something that carried today's weight in its lines, something quiet but unshakable, something forged like truth, under heat, with care until it lasts. I welded until the stars came out, and with every strike of fire, I felt the burn of shame, not mine but hers from earlier that week, turn to ash and lift away. Because pride, once broken, doesn't always come back in the shape it left. Sometimes it returns as dignity, not loud, not declared, just there, in the steady hands of a man who no longer needs to be seen to know who he is, but who was seen anyway. The seasons shifted, as they always do. Spring melted into summer, and the memory of that day at the school settled into something quieter, not forgotten, but folded gently into the rhythm of time. Life didn't stop for it. The sun still rose over job sites. Steel still had to be cut and carried. The grind of machinery still hummed through my mornings, but something inside me had changed, not in volume but in weight, and somewhere, on a desk not far from where that moment had happened, the textbook still lay. Maybe it had been placed back on a shelf. Maybe it was now part of the standard rotation in class. Maybe he'd started using it more carefully. Or maybe he avoided the acknowledgments altogether. I didn't know. I didn't need to. Because now, every time that teacher turned to that section, whether for a lesson, a quick reference, or a random check, my name was there. Not as a footnote of bitterness, not as a mark of triumph, but as a quiet, immovable fact. I was part of the foundation he taught from. He couldn't open those pages without seeing the name of the man he had once dismissed. And not just seeing it, but remembering it. And perhaps more than that, understanding what it had come to mean. Because names in books don't fade as quickly as words spoken in ignorance. Just a welder, he had said. And maybe he hadn't meant it cruelly. Maybe it had slipped from the comfortable shelf of assumptions he'd never had to question. But assumptions, like steel under pressure, eventually reveal their flaws. And now that one had cracked, right there in front of his students, in front of his own eyes, under the full, undeniable light of truth. I think about that often. Not out of pride, but out of peace. Because there is something deeply healing in knowing that the work you've done, the life you've lived, can outlast the smallness of someone else's vision. That when people try to shrink you to fit their comfort, it doesn't change your true size. That truth, once revealed, doesn't need defending. It stands on its own, just like steel. I've always believed in quiet strength, not because I'm humble by nature, but because I've seen what silence can carry. I've seen how the loudest voices often build nothing, while the silent hands hold up the world. My granddaughter still carries that textbook now and then, sometimes to study, sometimes just to reread that page. She once folded a sticky note over the paragraph with my name and wrote, "My grandpa helped make this, not to boast, just to anchor the memory." And that's when I knew. This story didn't end in that classroom. It began there. Or rather, it revealed itself there. It had always existed in the welds, the beams, the burns. But now it had a voice, a place, a witness. My name printed in small type on a quiet page would live longer than the dismissal I'd once received, and longer than the man who'd said it. Not because of ego, but because the work spoke louder than his words ever could. One day, long after we're both gone, a student will open that book. They won't know who I was. They won't know what was said. But they'll read the story of that bridge, and they'll see the list of contributors, and my name will be there. Simple, steady, unmoved. And somewhere out there, that bridge will still be standing. Because when you build with care, when you weld with purpose, live with honesty, speak without shouting, you leave something behind that resists rust. Not just in steel, but in memory, in paper, in people. That's what lasts. That's what matters. And that was always enough.